main components, some very basic things, we can use them to help our rice production. So when I get to, the first time I get to know algae in rice, and I started to do the literature review, I actually get surprised because I found that algae problem in rice was the only unique cases that it's happening in the world. And all the literatures from the very first time you would find that algae was a really good thing in rice. And all the scientists, great scientists in the world, they always mention the nitrogen fixation capacity of the algae. Well, actually, I got that quote from one of the handbooks published by Aeration in 1980, and Professor Roger was very famous, I think, nutrition biologist, phycologist there at the time. And he also mentioned that quote that, well, one of the place actually when people started realizing algae is important was the observation of that in a poor soil area that people are growers or farmers growing rice, there is still enough and sustainable amount of yield production, and how that amount of rice can be produced while they don't put any fertilizers into the soil. And then they came up with that idea, okay, something like blue-green algae, and the algae with the ability to fixing nitrogen actually compensate that amount. But the thing is that when I looked at the number of the publications over time that you can see in this graph, so he actually, that in that handbook, it was initially some of the publications, they mentioned that trend that was increasing. But when I get to the last decades from 2000 till now, the number of the publications and research in this very fascinating area, even from the positive perspective of algae in rice and how it can be used for fertilizing the soil, it's kind of being steady. So I don't see that much of, like, I haven't seen any increase of that number of research in this area. And maybe I'm wrong, but I have a feeling that it's related to some difficulties of managing algae and reproducing algae in a larger scale to inoculate the fields and providing it to the growers, which which make it like fertilizers like urea are still more very trustable and sustainable for production compared to the algae, even though it might be cheaper. So getting back to rice, I work only, well, I like always having a positive things about every system that I worked on. I know that from the farmer's perspective, from the rice production perspective, we want to increase our rice yield and we want to protect our crop. And that's why I brought the positive things. So from the negative things is, as I mentioned, this is the only unique thing happening in in the US and in California. Then the reason is related to the way we planted and we do our cultivation processes. As I mentioned, everything is done in California through the air. Seeds are pre-germinated and spread into the flooded field. So field is flooded, fertilizers are added beforehand, and then it's a very favorable situation for algae to take over even before the rice come up. And then there is a kind of 7 to 10 days empty window, like the 7 to 10 days time before the rice comes up off the soil and get established, that algae can take over and become problematic. So what it happens that once the algae mat gets on the surface of the water, rice seedlings, which are very tiny, and Liberty showed that that tiny little seeds with little nick on it, they cannot get through that mat out. The other issue is that the amount of the water received into the amount of the light received into the water also decrease, which shading also can influence the rice seedlings to emerge easily. The other problem with the algae is that, as I mentioned, algae can, algae mat or the whole community can move their place in the water column. So, so when, for example, the amount of CO2 or oxygen is changing in the water, so algae mat is just moving up and down, and with that movement, it can bring all the rice seedlings out and just uproot them. So these are the problems that we get with algae and establishment of the rice. So what should we do with that? So we have some initial information, and before going to how we can manage it, I wanted to show that feel to you, that how severe the impact of algae it can get if it's not managed properly. As you can see that half of this field, like the whole field is just infected with algae, and half of it is green and rice comes up, but the other part, it just everything just entangled into all the rice seedlings entangled in this thick mass of algae. And to solve this problem, there are like many ways, like cultural methods and chemical methods combining together, and time-specific management, you can control the algae. So as I mentioned, we need rice to be, like the flooded rice, to be algae-free in a short period of time in the beginning of the season, usually from as you can see here, these are the like cohorts of rice growing in California. And I borrowed this one from the California rice. And you can see that here we want this period, like this 5 to 10 days, to be like 10 days while that algae, like rice is in less than 5 leaf stage, be algae free. And there were some study in the past to figure it out, that what type of algae group we're gonna get in this time span. And you can see that here with these arrows, and I put it here, you can see that in just only 20 days, less than 20 days, you can see that how these communities are changing. Some of them are staying longer, some of them it just can be found in very early stages, and some of them, like cyanobacteria, come to the system, like just getting into the system later. So how we should manage this algae species? Can we just rely, like herbicides we have different mode of action, and not all of them are good for a specific weed. So we have broadleaf broadleaves and grasses, and then we need to use different herbicides for everything. So how we can manage such a more diverse community of algae? If we control one of them, well, there's going to be lots of opportunity for the other ones to come up. And then here I think with the algae control and management, these 4 factors are really important, and they always need to be incorporated with each other to get a good good control of the algae and just keep our rice safe, and not getting something like these wimpy seedlings of rice entangled in algae. So talking about each of these factors, I'm gonna show that how water management is important. It can be used for that. So in California system, after the flooding of rice, like about, I think once and there's sometimes growers prefer to bring the water down. That was called snapping or leathering. So what they do in this period, like about 7 days, I think to 10 days after the spread of the flooding the field and spreading the rice, which helps the rice seedlings to establish faster and better. And sometimes they incorporate some of the herbicide applications or herbicide applications within this time that they bring in the drying the field. And once you dry the field, actually it automatically helps to clean the field from the algae, and you just solve the problem faster. Not entirely solve the problem, but you give an opportunity to rice to establish, but at the same time you decrease your pressure of the algae. And this was what I observed while I was doing my experiment 2 years ago, that I had a kind of discover of algae in the beginning, and 2 days later, the water started to like just the bloods were just get emptied from the water. And then when I came back, like on 11th, like the 5 days later, there was no algae left, and rice was there. And I think it's promising, but it's also might not be very practical for growers that have large checks of rice, like when the field is just big, especially in California, that there are like the fields, rice fields are could be reached to even 100, I don't know, 10 acre or 100 acres. So it's a kind of quite a big field to manage that huge amount of water, empty the field and bring the water back. So it might not be that easy to implement water management, but it's very promising, and it's very easy if you have a smaller field to handle algae with water management. The other option, which is really encouraged in California, and I'm also trying to learn them more, is that we know that algae species are nutrient limited. So, but we need to put the fertilizers into the soil because rice needs it. So in California, usually it's very like a common thing that nutrients, nitrogen applied as a form of aqua injected into the soil prior to planting, and phosphorus applied as a form of ammonium phosphate on the surface of the water, the surface of the soil, and get disk into the soil minimally. So if we and so how we can, like, this is a conventional method in California. So how we can use how we can use to decrease the amount of decrease the accessibility of the algae to the fertilizers. One of the suggested ways and previously researched thing is that delay the application of the phosphorus up to 5 weeks, 5 weeks after the flooding, after the seedling, like spreading the seeds, or even incorporate the fertilizers more into the soil, or even like splitting the application, like application of the nitrogen and phosphorus, like early in the beginning, and then do the rest of it later. So these are all possible. Again, it needs to be studied more and investigated more. And because we love our rice a lot, we want to have a kind of robust and sustainable yield. So this is really important to make sure that if we incorporate any of these methods into our management, whether we're gonna lose our rice yield or not. So then there's this is actually a part of my study that I'm showing here, that how increasing the amount of nitrogen or phosphorus can change the algae coverage area and the dry on the left, and the dry biomass of algae. And once you have both fertilizers like nitrogen and phosphorus source together, you could see that more algae in terms of the coverage and more biomass. Also, this is another thing that I wanted to make emphasize on it, that it is not just one fertilizer is important. A combination of them also can induce algae to grow excessively. And we have to also consider that, okay, if we have some algae species that are phosphol and they love phosphorus, so if we put the phosphorus, those ones gonna take over. If we remove the phosphorus and they only add in nitrogen, the other ones that are nitrophilic may take over. And the last thing that we have in our toolbox, usually we call it like in management perspective, we have number of chemicals, and most of those chemical options or algicides are copper based or hydrogen peroxide, and they show promising that they are promising for controlling algae. However, their effect is very short. And for applying any of these things, we also need to think about the scale, scope, timing, and regulations of our system to apply any of these algicides into the environment, because copper compounds also can cause soil pollution. So this is also another drawback with these things. So with all of these things, I think we need to, there's one thing that I forgot about it. So this is something that I've realized, I've learned it from some of the growers, that they have a smaller field. They put some bubblers into their field. So then it brings the oxygen and release the oxygen into the field, and it breaks the algae mat. And sometimes they use a kind of wind blower and or aerator to just remove the algae from the surface of water in the emergency. But probably they are only practical in small scale, not the larger scale. And with all of these things, management is just, it's a one of the, like as you can see here, circles, so I say it's a one of the gears of combination of the science, outreach, and together. And with having all these things together, we may able to manage such a problematic thing with algae. But it doesn't mean that it's always problematic. It's, as I mentioned, like even with the weeds, we always say that weeds are plants that are not undesired or just growing in a place that we don't want them. And because they are growing in our rice fields in the beginning of the season and it caused the bloom, we don't want them. But other than that, I just wanted to emphasize that algae is the kind of backbone of the life and life on planet, and many of our species and plants are actually originated or evolved from that point in the history of the human history of life and tree of the life. And for the last thing, there's a very fun point and like an interesting point. When I was reading and doing literature about algae, I realized that, well, actually the idea, like it's a classic movie of Hitchcock, and it's called Bird. Many people have probably seen it. And actually the director got the idea of that movie from the death of many birds that happening, and he read it in the newspaper. But later, when the scientists went out and realized that disease that birds are dying actually were infected with an toxic algae, and that became a kind of idea for making that film. And with that, I would say thank you, and thank you for listening to this talk. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
So we have few questions for you, Dr. Sara. The first one comes from Mohammed Azam Khan. He's asked, what's the optimum temperature for the algae required for the development?
Oh, it's a very broad question, because as I mentioned, there are hundreds of species of algae and there might be a different temperature requirement for any of them. But the ones that I know that they grow, like many of them like higher temperature, they're like something above 25 to 35, that might be a favorable situation for them to grow. But it doesn't mean that they cannot grow in a lower temperature. There are species of algae that they can grow even during the winter in the water bodies, because the changes in the temperature in the water is not as much as the soil. And then they can survive, even though they grow slower, but they can survive and grow. So and it's also, again, like weeds are lots of crops and every organisms, they need their own specific requirements. So I cannot say that what's the optimum temperature for algae development. Yeah.
So next from KV Kothale, he is asked, which algal form you found to be most effective in rice growth?
Uh, well, thank you for the question. I'm looking from not having algae in the rice in the beginning, but many cyanobacteria species, some of them very popular and probably like you may heard of them, the genus they called Gnostic algae or Anabina are the very famous ones for doing nitrification and fixing nitrogen into the soil. And they are the ones that are some strains of it always used to be encouraged to the growers. The ones that I read in the literature, especially in India, they were encouraged to the growers to have it as a pond near their field and then grow the algae in it and then spread it and inoculate it into their field. So these are the two main ones that I know of.
Okay, so there is one question from me. You told
Mhm.
about the physical management of algal bloom by
That's right.
doing aeration of the field.
Yes.
So, do you think that aeration of field could affect the rice yield negatively? Because there are many rice varieties which are submergence varieties, which
Yeah,
grow
of course, like if,
nicely
for
when
example, if,
submerged.
yeah, this is something that hasn't been explored yet. It's an kind of an idea. And at the same time, yeah, if you put a kind of a bubbling or just putting aeration into the water, imagine that you have it in a pond and you have an aeration. So there's going to be a lot of water movement. And let's say in California system that we got seeds are not established and they should be established by themselves, are not transplanted. So there might be lots of water movement and they probably definitely can affect the rice yield. But these are all the questions and unexplored areas that I'm trying in this time that I'm at UC Davis try to answer some of these questions and trying different ways to figure out, okay, which one might be a better option for which scenarios. And as I always mention, and Liberty mentioned, like the management or IPM is just not one way of things. You may use that aeration for some purposes, but you cannot use it for other locations or scenarios. So that I can say it's everything. Just you have to have a really great observation as a farmer, as a grower, as a researcher, and see which tools you can use more effectively and like practically.
Okay. So, any ideal threshold level of algae for better rice yield? Like,
I
okay, this
cannot,
much can be allowed, and beyond
yeah,
this,
this is a
it is
very
harmful.
detailed thing, and I can do research about it and find that, okay, what can be the ideal, like how much algae you have to have in the field that could be enough for nitrogen fixation. But at the moment, I can I can find some papers and put it in your chat box and see people if they can interested, they can use it. Yeah.
Okay, that would be really nice of you.
Yeah. No
So,
problem.
coming towards the end of our webinar, I would like you to uh, give some inspiration to our young researchers, if
Mm,
you can guide them towards their research journey as a plant
yeah, sure.
scientist.
Yeah, so I really like Liberty's comment, and I can emphasize on that. Don't scare, go forward, and like if you love something, just fight for it. And if you have a passion for science, any type of it, like if it makes sparkles in your eyes, just go for it. Don't scare of the people who know a lot, and they might encourage you, and never scares of the people. They may see it as an opportunity to be challenged and become a stronger and braver person. The other thing that I experienced myself, as I mentioned, I worked in different areas of like the plant science. I worked on weed science as my master degree. I did molecular ecology and population genetics, working specifically on uh, invasive plants in coastal habitats. Then I'm working in rice, meat, and algae, which is can be kind of, it's a plant, but it's toward an aquatic system and microbial community. And the thing is that when you learn about science and how to do the research, when you understand what is hypothesis and how to make a question, and then when you develop your mind, it doesn't matter what's in front of you. You can be brave and you can be be confident on what your skills you have, and just go for it. Yeah, so that I can say. And don't scare off like all the negativity in the world and all the things that might not be a like future job or something. When you do that and when you do it right, you will find your place. And you will build that place for yourself. You don't need people to give it to you. You can have it yourself. That's what I can say.
Oh, that's fabulous. Thank you so much, Dr. Sara.